In the fog-shrouded redwood forests of Northern California, March 1932, while the rest of America was learning new words like breadline and Hooverville, a woman named Cora Whitmore stood in a clearing with 3 children clinging to her skirt. She watched her husband's truck disappear down the logging road for the last time. He had not said goodbye. He had not explained. He had simply loaded his clothes into the cab, taken the strongbox with their savings, all $47 of it, and driven away without looking back. He left behind a wife of 12 years, 3 children under the age of 10, a rented cabin with 2 weeks left on the lease, and a note on the kitchen table that said only 11 words. I cannot do this anymore. Cora Whitmore was 31 years old. She had no family to return to, no skills that anyone would pay for in the depths of the Depression, and no idea how she would feed her children past the end of the month. The company that owned the cabin would evict her in 14 days. The company store had already cut off her credit. The other logging families struggling with their own troubles offered sympathy, but could spare nothing more. In 2 weeks, Cora Whitmore and her children would be homeless in one of the most remote and unforgiving landscapes in America. What happened over the next year would become one of the most remarkable survival stories these forests have ever known. A story of a mother's determination, children's resilience, and a tree so ancient and vast that it became something no one expected. A home. If you are not subscribed to this channel, now is the time. Because this story will change the way you think about what a family can endure and what shelter can mean. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. And let me tell you about the woman who raised her children inside a living giant. The redwood forests of Humboldt County in 1932 were a world unto themselves. Trees that had been growing since before the Roman Empire rose 300 feet into the air, their trunks so massive that early settlers had driven carriages through tunnels carved in their bases. The forest floor was a cathedral of ferns and sorrel, perpetually shrouded in fog that rolled in from the Pacific and hung in the branches like ghosts. It was beautiful, but it was not kind. The winters were wet and cold. The summers were damp and cool, and the isolation could break a person's spirit faster than the weather could break their body. Cora had come to this place as a young bride following her husband Vernon from their family's farms in Oklahoma to the promise of steady work in the lumber camps. For 8 years, Vernon had cut down the giants while Cora kept house in a succession of company cabins, each one more remote than the last. She had borne 3 children in these forests. Emmett, now 9 years old, a serious boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's watchful eyes. Opal, 7, quick and curious with a mind that never stopped asking questions. And little Teddy just turned 5, still young enough to believe that the world was mostly good and that his parents would always protect him. Cora had learned to live with the fog and the rain, with the isolation and the rough company of logging families, with a husband who grew more distant with each passing year. She had not learned how to live without him. The signs had been there if she had been willing to see them. Vernon had always been a quiet man, but his silences had grown heavier over the past 2 years. He came home later from the logging sites, drank more whiskey on the weekends, looked at his children sometimes with an expression that Cora could not read, but that frightened her when she caught glimpses of it. The Depression had hit the logging industry hard. Crews were being cut. Wages were being slashed. Men who had spent their whole lives in the timber trade were being told there was no work for them anymore. Vernon had kept his job, but just barely, and the fear of losing it had done something to him, twisted something inside him that Cora did not know how to reach. She had tried to talk to him about it, tried to ask what was wrong, what she could do to help. He had looked at her with those empty eyes and said nothing. And then, one morning in March, she woke to find his side of the bed cold, his clothes gone from the hooks by the door, the strongbox missing from its hiding place beneath the loose floorboard. She found the note on the kitchen table weighted down with his wedding ring. 11 words. I cannot do this anymore. She read it once, twice, 3 times. The words did not change. She walked outside in her nightgown barefoot in the cold mud and saw the fresh tire tracks leading away down the logging road. She followed them with her eyes until they disappeared into the fog, and she stood there not feeling the cold, not feeling anything at all, until Emmett came out and took her hand and led her back inside. The first 3 days after Vernon left, Cora did not leave the cabin. She sat at the kitchen table, reading and rereading his note, trying to understand how 12 years of marriage could end in 11 words. The children moved around her like small ghosts, sensing that something terrible had happened, but not understanding what. Emmett, old enough to grasp that his father was not coming back, took charge of his younger siblings. He fed them from the dwindling supplies in the pantry, kept them quiet while their mother stared at nothing, made sure Teddy washed his hands before eating, and that Opal did not wander too far from the cabin. 9 years old, and already carrying a weight no child should have to bear, Opal understood that something was wrong but did not know how to name it. She asked where Papa had gone, and Emmett told her he had gone away for work. She asked when he was coming back, and Emmett said he did not know. She stopped asking after the second day, but Cora could see the confusion in her daughter's eyes, the hurt that had no words. Teddy was too young to understand any of it. He knew only that his mother was sad, and that his father's boots were not by the door anymore. He crawled into Cora's lap on the second night and fell asleep there. And she held him without moving, without sleeping, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling until dawn. 3 days of silence. 3 days of nothing. 3 days while the calendar pages turned, and the eviction date crept closer, and the pantry grew emptier. And Cora Whitmore sat at her kitchen table trying to understand how her life had collapsed so completely and so quickly. On the 3rd night, she dreamed of her mother. Her mother had been dead for 7 years, taken by the influenza that had swept through Oklahoma in the winter of '25. But in the dream, she was alive and young, younger than Cora had ever known her. She was standing at the edge of a forest, and she was saying something that Cora could not quite hear. She woke before dawn on the 4th day with her mother's voice still echoing in her ears. Words that she could not remember but that had left behind a feeling that sitting still was the same as dying. Cora Whitmore got up from the table. She took Vernon's note, the note she had read perhaps 100 times, and she carried it to the stove. She opened the iron door and fed the paper to the flames, watched it curl and blacken and disappear. And then she began to plan. She had 2 weeks before eviction, almost no money. The company store would not extend credit. The nearest town, Fortuna, was 15 miles away, and she had no way to get there except on foot. Even if she reached town, there was no work for women, especially not women with 3 young children in tow. The county poorhouse was an option, but Cora had heard stories about what happened to families there, how they separated children from mothers, how disease swept through the overcrowded dormitories, how children who went in sometimes never came out. She would die before she let strangers take her children. There had to be another way. She went to the window and looked out at the forest that surrounded the cabin, the massive trunks rising into the fog, the undergrowth thick and green and impenetrable. For 8 years, this forest had been a prison, the walls of her isolation, the boundary of a life she had not chosen and could not escape. Now she looked at it differently, not as a prison, but as a possibility. Cora began walking the forest in the hours when the children napped. She told Emmett to watch his siblings, told him she needed to look for something. He did not ask what, and she did not explain. But he nodded with that serious expression that made him look so much older than his 9 years. And she knew he would keep his brother and sister safe while she was gone. She walked the logging roads first, then the game trails that branched off from them, then the creek beds and the ridge lines that had no trails at all. She walked until her shoes wore through and she had to wrap her feet in rags. She did not know what she was looking for. She only knew that she would recognize it when she found it. The forest was vast and trackless, but Cora began to learn its patterns. The way the fog moved through the valleys in the morning and lifted toward midday. The places where sunlight broke through the canopy and created small clearings of warmth and light. The sounds of the different birds and what they meant. The tracks of deer and rabbits and the larger, more dangerous animals that she had to be aware of. On the 5th day of her searching, she found an abandoned trapper's shelter, half collapsed and rotting. She considered it briefly, but the roof was gone, and the walls were too far gone to repair. On the 6th day, she found a shallow cave in a hillside, but water seeped from the back wall, and the floor was permanently damp. On the 7th day, she found nothing at all. On the 8th day, she walked farther than she had ever walked before, following a creek into a valley she had never seen. The trees here were older than the ones near the logging camp, larger, untouched by the saws that had felled so many of their brothers. She was about to turn back when she saw it. A tree standing alone in a small clearing separated from the main groves by some accident of geography or fate. It was a coastal redwood, but unlike any Cora had ever seen. Its trunk was not the straight column typical of its kind. Instead, it was a massive, bulging base that flared outward like the skirts of a giant. At ground level, the trunk measured over 60 feet in circumference. Cora walked around it, slowly trailing her hand along the bark, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingers. And then she saw the opening. On the side of the tree, facing away from the prevailing winds, there was an archway in the wood, perhaps 5 feet wide and 6 feet tall. An entrance into darkness. Cora's heart began to beat faster. She approached slowly, almost reverently. The opening had been formed by some ancient injury. A lightning strike, perhaps, or a fire that had hollowed out the heartwood while leaving the living sapwood intact. The edges were smooth with age, softened by centuries of wind and rain. She stepped inside and found herself in a space larger than any room in her cabin. The hollow extended upward into darkness, but at ground level, it was roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet across. The walls were the living wood of the tree itself, reddish-brown and surprisingly smooth, curved like the inside of a cathedral dome. The floor was soft, with centuries of accumulated duff, dry and springy underfoot, and despite the fog outside, the interior was dry. The living tree shed water like a roof channeling rain down its bark and away from the hollow within. Cora stood in the center of that space and turned slowly, taking it all in. The air inside smelled of cedar and earth, ancient and clean. She reached out and touched the wall, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingers, sensing somehow the life that still pulsed through it. The tree was not dead. It was not even dying. It had simply made room, had created this space within itself where something else might live. Cora thought of the stories her grandmother had told her as a child, stories of spirits that lived in trees, of forests that protected those who respected them. She had never believed those stories. But standing in this hollow, she understood why people had told them. She noticed other things as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. Small openings higher up in the hollow where light filtered through. Natural windows that would brighten the space during the day. A section of the floor that was slightly raised, drier than the rest. Perfect for sleeping. A natural shelf where the wood curved inward, already shaped to hold supplies. The tree had not just created a space, it had created a home. All it needed was someone willing to see it. Cora stood in the center of that hollow for a long time, looking up into the darkness above, feeling the presence of the ancient tree around her. The tree was still alive, still growing, still adding rings to its massive trunk. It had been standing here for perhaps 2,000 years, had survived fires and floods and earthquakes and the arrival of humans with their saws and axes. It had survived everything the world had thrown at it, and now perhaps it would help her survive too. She measured the distance back to the cabin in her mind. 2 miles through dense forest. A difficult walk, but not impossible, even with 3 children. Even with supplies. She thought about what she would need, what she could carry, what she could leave behind. She thought about her children's faces when she told them, and then she thought about their faces if she did not tell them, if she simply gave up. Let the company evict them. Let the county take them to the poorhouse. Let strangers separate them and send them to different places where she might never see them again. No. She had lost her husband. She would not lose her children. And she would not let her children lose their home. This tree, this ancient living giant. This was their chance. Maybe their only chance. Cora did not tell anyone about the tree. Not the neighbors who came to offer awkward condolences. Not the company foreman who came to remind her of the eviction date. Not even her children. Not yet. She spent the next 5 days preparing. During the days, she gathered supplies from the cabin, things she could claim as her own because she had brought them to the marriage or made them herself. Blankets that her mother had quilted. Cooking pots that had belonged to her grandmother. The few tools that were hers rather than the company's. She gathered candles and matches. A small amount of dried food. rope and wire and needles and thread. She made mental lists of what they could carry and what they would have to leave behind. During the evenings, after the children were asleep, she scouted the route from the cabin to the tree. She marked the trail in her mind, noting landmarks that she could follow even in the dark. A fallen log shaped like an archway, a boulder split down the middle by some ancient force, a creek crossing where the water ran shallow over flat stones. She walked the route 3 times, memorizing every turn, until she could have followed it with her eyes closed. She did not sleep much during those 5 days, but she did not sit at the kitchen table anymore either. She was done with sitting. On the 12th day after Vernon's departure, the day before she would be evicted from the cabin, Cora finally told her children. She gathered them after supper and sat them down in front of the cold fireplace. Emmett on one side, Opal on the other, Teddy in her lap. She told them that they were going on an adventure. She told them that she had found a special place in the forest, a secret place that no one else knew about. A place where they could live together, just the 4 of them, without having to worry about the company or the eviction or any of the things that had made their mother so sad these past 2 weeks. Opal's eyes grew wide with excitement. Teddy clapped his hands because his sister seemed happy. Only Emmett looked at her with those serious, knowing eyes. "Is it safe, Mama?" Cora looked at her oldest son, this boy who had become a man in the space of 2 weeks. This child who had held the family together while she fell apart. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I know it's safer than the alternative. And I know we'll be together. That's what matters most." Emmett nodded slowly. "Then we'll go," he said. "I'll help you carry things." They packed that night. Cora had already prepared bundles for each of them, blankets rolled tight and tied with rope, pots nested inside each other with dried beans and rice filling the gaps, tools wrapped in cloth to keep them from clanging. She gave Emmett the heaviest pack because he was the strongest, gave Opal a smaller bundle with clothes and candles, let Teddy carry his own blanket and a small bag of his treasures, a wooden horse that Vernon had carved for him on his 3rd birthday, a smooth stone from the creek, a feather he had found and kept because he liked the colors. Cora carried the most. Everything else they could not bear to leave behind. She woke them at 3 in the morning. The forest was black as pitch, but she had planned for this. She lit a single candle, shielding it with her hand, and led her children out the back door of the cabin, away from the road, away from the other cabins, into the trees. They walked in single file, Cora in front with the candle, Emmett behind her holding Teddy's hand, Opal at the rear, brave and quiet in the darkness. The forest at night was full of sounds, the rustle of unseen animals in the undergrowth, the hoot of owls, the creak of branches in the wind. Teddy whimpered once, and Emmett squeezed his hand tighter. Opal hummed a quiet tune to herself, something their grandmother used to sing. Cora followed the route she had memorized. The fallen log, the split boulder, the creek crossing. 2 miles through the darkness, 2 hours of walking. And then, just as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, they reached the clearing. The tree rose before them, massive and dark against the lightening sky. Opal gasped. Teddy hid his face against Emmett's leg. Emmett stared with wide eyes, his serious expression finally cracking into something like wonder. "Mama," Opal whispered, "it's the biggest tree in the whole world." Cora smiled for the first time in 2 weeks. "Maybe not the whole world," she said, "but it's ours now. Come, let me show you inside." She led them through the opening in the trunk, into the hollow, into their new home. The children spread out across the space exploring. Teddy touched the walls with his small hands, feeling the smooth wood. Opal looked up into the darkness above and asked if fairies lived at the top. Emmett walked the perimeter, already thinking about practical things, where they would sleep, where they would store food, how they would stay warm. Cora set down her pack and watched them. This was not what she had imagined for her children. Not the life she had dreamed of when she married Vernon all those years ago in Oklahoma. Not the future she had pictured when she held each of them as newborns and whispered promises into their tiny ears. But it was what they had, and she would make it enough. She would make it more than enough. She would make it a home. That morning, while her children explored their new world, Cora walked back to the edge of the clearing and looked toward the east, toward the logging camp, toward the life she was leaving behind. The company foreman would arrive at the cabin in a few hours. He would find it empty. He would assume they had walked to town. He would file his paperwork and think no more about the Whitmore family. He could not have imagined where they had actually gone. No one could. And that was exactly how Cora wanted it. She turned back to the tree, to the sounds of her children's voices echoing from within, to the beginning of something new. The forest had taken everything from her: her husband, her home, her certainty about the future. But the forest had also given her something. This tree, this ancient giant, this chance. What she did with that chance was up to her. Cora Whitmore took a deep breath of the cold morning air, and then she walked back into the hollow to begin the work of building a life from nothing. She did not know that she would live in this tree for 23 years. She did not know that her children would grow up within these wooden walls, learning skills that would serve them for the rest of their lives. She did not know that her name would become a legend in these forests, a story that people would tell for generations. All she knew was that she had 3 children who needed her, and she was not gonna let them down. The first day in the tree was a day of discovery. Cora explored every inch of the hollow, noting its features and its possibilities. The floor was roughly level, sloping slightly toward the entrance. The walls rose 15 feet before curving inward, and above that the hollow continued upward into darkness. She could not see how high it went, but when she called out, her voice echoed back from somewhere far above. Natural ventilation. That was good. Smoke could rise and escape. Fresh air could flow in from below. The entrance faced northeast, away from the prevailing winds that blew in from the Pacific. That was why the interior stayed dry, even when rain lashed the forest outside. The tree's massive bulk shielded the opening from the worst of the weather. She found 3 smaller openings higher up in the walls, places where branches had once grown and fallen away, leaving gaps in the wood. During the day, light filtered through these natural windows, casting shifting patterns on the floor. As the sun moved across the sky, she found the shelf she had noticed on her first visit, a natural depression in the wall where the wood had grown around some long-vanished obstruction. It was the perfect size for storing their food supplies. She found a section of the floor that was slightly elevated where centuries of accumulated debris had built up into a raised platform. Drier than the rest of the floor. Warmer. The obvious place for sleeping. The children had found their own discoveries. Emmett had located a small spring about 50 yards from the tree, where water bubbled up from between two rocks and flowed away into a creek. Fresh water close at hand. Essential for survival. Opal had found a patch of ferns growing near the tree's base that she declared the most beautiful ferns in the world. She had already begun planning a garden. Teddy had found a knot in the wood that looked like a face, and he had named it Mr. Tree, and was conducting a serious conversation with it about the proper way to treat guests. Cora watched them and felt something loosen in her chest. They were going to be all right. They were going to make this work. That first night, they slept in a pile, all four of them together on the raised section of the floor, wrapped in blankets, huddled close for warmth. The hollow was cold after the sun went down, colder than the cabin had been with its iron stove. But it was dry and it was safe, and they were together. Teddy fell asleep first, curled against his mother's side. Opal followed her, breathing, slowing and deepening as exhaustion overtook excitement. Emmett stayed awake longer, lying on his back, staring up into the darkness above. "Mama," he whispered, "do you think Papa knows where we are?" Cora was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "I don't think he does. Do you think he would come looking for us if he knew?" Another long silence. "I don't know, Emmett. I don't know what your father would do. I don't think I ever really knew." Emmett digested this. "I'm glad we came here," he said. "I'm glad it's just us now." Cora reached over and squeezed his hand. "Get some sleep. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow." But long after her children were asleep, Cora lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, the wind in the branches, the calls of night birds, the occasional rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. She had brought her children to this place on instinct and desperation. She had no real plan beyond survival, no skills beyond determination, no resources beyond what they had carried on their backs. The skeptics would say she had made a terrible mistake, that a hollow tree was no place to raise children, that she was condemning them to hardship and suffering and possibly death. Maybe they would be right, but she thought about the alternative, the poorhouse, the separation, the loss of everything that made them a family. And she knew she had made the only choice she could make. Tomorrow, the work would begin. Building a life from nothing. Building a home from a hollow in a tree. But tonight she would let herself rest. She closed her eyes. And in the darkness of that ancient tree, surrounded by her sleeping children, Cora Whitmore finally allowed herself to hope. Having shelter does not mean having a home. Having a home does not mean you will survive. And survival does not mean you will not suffer along the way. Cora Whitmore learned these lessons in the first weeks after she brought her children to live inside a 2,000-year-old tree. She learned them in the cold before dawn and the dark after sunset. She learned them in her aching muscles and her empty stomach and her children's frightened faces. But she also learned something else. She learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. And that strength, once discovered, could not be taken away. The first week in the tree was the hardest. Cora had brought blankets and cooking pots, a small amount of food, matches and candles, the few tools she could carry. But the hollow tree was not yet a home. It was a shelter, nothing more. A dry space out of the rain where they could sleep without freezing. The children were frightened and confused. Teddy was the worst. He cried for his father every night. Great heaving sobs that echoed off the wooden walls and broke Cora's heart into smaller and smaller pieces. He did not understand why they had left the cabin, did not understand why Papa was not coming to find them, did not understand why his mother's eyes were so sad, even when she smiled. 5 years old. Too young for this. Too young for any of this. Cora held him through the long nights, rocking him against her chest, murmuring words she did not believe into his hair. It's going to be all right. We're safe here. Papa loved you very much. Lies and half-truths and desperate hopes spoken into the darkness while her other children pretended to sleep. Opal adapted more quickly, treating their situation as an adventure, a fairy tale come to life. She explored every corner of the hollow, gave names to the knots and whorls in the wood, created elaborate stories about the tree and its history. In her imagination, they were not refugees hiding from eviction. They were pioneers discovering a new world, explorers charting unknown territory. Cora envied her daughter's ability to transform hardship into wonder. Emmett said little. He worked alongside his mother with a determination that made Cora's heart ache with pride and sorrow. 9 years old, and he had already left childhood behind. He carried wood without being asked, fetched water from the spring without complaint, watched over his younger siblings with a vigilance that should have belonged to an adult. Sometimes Cora caught him staring at nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes far away. She knew he was thinking about his father. She did not know what to say to make it better. So she said nothing, and they worked side by side in silence, and the silence became its own kind of communication. They needed fire for warmth and cooking, but Cora was terrified of burning down the tree that sheltered them. The wood was ancient and dry in places, and she had visions of flames racing up the hollow interior, consuming everything, leaving them with nothing at all. She solved this problem by building a fire pit outside the entrance. It took her 2 days to get it right. She gathered stones from the creek flat, ones that would not crack in the heat, and arranged them in a circle about 10 feet from the tree's base. She positioned it so the prevailing winds would carry the smoke away from the hollow, rather than into it. She dug a shallow pit in the center and lined it with more stones. The first fire she built was small and tentative. She fed it twigs and dry leaves, watching the flames carefully, ready to smother them at the first sign of danger. But the fire behaved itself. The smoke rose and drifted away through the trees. The heat radiated outward in a warm circle. The children gathered around it that evening, their faces lit by the flickering light. And for the first time since they had arrived, they looked almost happy. They cooked there and warmed themselves there, but slept inside the tree where the walls held the residual warmth and blocked the wind. It was not comfortable, but it was enough. They needed food, and Cora had brought almost none. This was the problem that kept her awake at night, staring up into the darkness of the hollow, doing calculations in her head that never came out right. 3 children. growing children. Children who needed more than the handfuls of dried beans and rice she had carried from the cabin. She had to learn to feed them from the forest. She had to learn fast. Cora Whitmore had never hunted in her life, had never set a trap or cleaned a rabbit or identified a wild plant. She had grown up on a farm in Oklahoma, yes, but her work had been in the house, not the fields. Cooking and cleaning and mending. Women's work. Work that had not prepared her for this. But necessity is a harsh teacher, and Cora was a quick student. She started with snares. She had brought wire from the cabin, a coil of it that Vernon had used for repairs around the property. She remembered seeing a trapper once, years ago, demonstrating how to make a simple snare. A loop of wire. A bent sapling for tension. A trigger mechanism that would close the loop when an animal passed through. Her first 3 attempts failed completely. The 4th caught a rabbit. Cora stood over it in the early morning light, watching it struggle against the wire, and felt something shift inside her. This was a living creature. She was about to kill it. She was about to take its life so that her children could live. She thought about Teddy's hungry face at breakfast. She thought about the way Opal's dresses were already growing loose. She thought about Emmett, who had stopped asking for seconds because he knew there were no seconds to give. Cora picked up a heavy stone, and she did what she had to do. That night they ate meat for the first time since leaving the cabin. The rabbit was small and stringy, but the children devoured it like it was the finest meal they had ever tasted. Teddy laughed for the first time in a week. Opal declared it better than Christmas dinner. Even Emmett allowed himself a small smile. Cora watched them eat and felt a fierce, primal satisfaction. She had provided for her family. She could do this. She set more snares the next day, and the day after that. Within a week, she had learned which trails the rabbits favored, which times of day they were most active, how to position the snares for maximum success. She caught 2 or 3 rabbits a week. It was not enough to live on, but it was a start. She learned to identify the edible plants of the forest. This was slower going, more dangerous. A mistake with a snare might mean a lost rabbit. A mistake with a plant could mean death. Cora proceeded with extreme caution. She started with the plants she recognized. Dandelion greens, which grew in the sunny patches near the creek. Clover, which was abundant in the clearings. Wild onions, whose distinctive smell made them impossible to mistake for anything else. Then she expanded her knowledge one plant at a time. Miner's lettuce, with its round leaves and tiny white flowers. Wood sorrel, whose clover-shaped leaves had a pleasant sour taste. The young shoots of ferns, which could be eaten raw or cooked. The inner bark of certain trees, which could be boiled into a nutritious, if unappetizing, mush. She taught herself to recognize the plants that were dangerous. The water hemlock that grew near the creek, beautiful and deadly. The death camas that could be mistaken for wild onion by the careless. The various mushrooms that she avoided entirely because the risk was too great. Opal became her eager assistant in this work. The 7-year-old had a natural gift for observation, for noticing the small differences that distinguished one plant from another. She memorized the shapes of leaves and the colors of flowers. She created her own names for the plants they found. Rabbit ears for the miner's lettuce. Sour clovers for the wood sorrel. Princess ferns for the edible fiddleheads. By the end of the first month, Opal knew the forest's bounty better than many adults who had lived in these woods their whole lives. Cora found a creek with trout about a quarter-mile from the tree. She taught Emmett how to catch them. They had no proper fishing gear, so they improvised. A length of thread from Cora's sewing kit, a bent pin for a hook, a stick for a pole, worms dug from the soft earth near the spring for bait. Emmett was patient in a way that most 9-year-olds were not. He could sit motionless for an hour, watching the water, waiting for the telltale ripple that meant a fish was near. When he finally felt a tug on the line, his reflexes were quick and sure. His first fish was tiny, barely bigger than his hand. He brought it back to the tree with a grin that transformed his serious face into something young and joyful. Within a few weeks, he was catching 2 or 3 fish a day. They ate, simply, but they ate. And slowly, Cora's fear of starvation began to recede. The hollow needed to be more than a cave. This was where Cora's transformation truly began. She had never built anything in her life, had always depended on Vernon for such things. If a shelf needed hanging or a door needed fixing, she waited for her husband to do it. That was the way things were. That was the way she had been raised. But Vernon was gone, and the waiting was over. She studied the hollow with new eyes, measured it with lengths of string, walked its perimeter again and again, noting the features she could use and the problems she would need to solve. The floor was first. The accumulated duff that covered the ground was soft and comfortable, but it was uneven and difficult to keep clean. Cora wanted a proper floor. Something solid. Something that felt like a home rather than a forest floor. She and Emmett spent 3 days gathering flat stones from the creek. They carried them 1 and 2 at a time, trudging back and forth along the trail that was becoming worn with their constant passage. They laid the stones in the areas where they would walk and work most often. Between the stones, they packed clay that Cora dug from a bank near the spring, pressing it into the gaps with her hands until the surface was level and solid. Over this, Cora laid the braided rag rugs she had brought from the cabin, islands of color and softness in the earthen room. The walls came next. The living wood of the tree was beautiful but cold to the touch. On chilly nights, the children pressed against it and shivered. Cora needed insulation, something to hold the warmth inside. She gathered bundles of dried ferns and grasses, wove them into mats using techniques she half remembered from her grandmother and half invented on the spot. She hung these mats against the walls, securing them with wooden pegs driven into the softer parts of the wood. The effect was immediate. The hollow felt warmer, softer, more like a room and less like a hole in a tree. She left gaps where the wood was most beautiful, treating those sections like windows that looked out onto nothing but the ancient heart of the tree. Light was a constant challenge. The entrance let in some daylight, and the natural windows higher up helped during the afternoon hours. But mornings were dim and evenings were dark, and Cora needed to see to work. She fashioned candle holders from clay, shaping them with her fingers and letting them dry in the sun. She positioned them around the space, creating pools of warm light in the evening hours. But candles were finite. She had brought only a dozen from the cabin, and they would not last forever. So she learned to make lamps. She took an empty tin can, one that had held beans in another life, and filled it with rendered animal fat from the rabbits she caught. She twisted a length of cloth into a wick and set it in the fat. The first time she lit it, the flame was smoky and unsteady, but it burned, and it kept burning hour after hour, giving off a soft glow that was enough to see by. She made more lamps, positioned them around the hollow, learned to render fat more efficiently to make wicks that burned cleaner to trim them so they did not smoke. By the end of the first month, the hollow had been transformed. There were sleeping areas for each child, marked off by hanging blankets, each one personalized with small treasures gathered from the forest. Emmett had hung a fish skeleton on his wall, bleached white by the sun. Opal had created a display of pressed flowers and colorful leaves. Teddy had his collection of smooth stones and interesting sticks arranged on a small shelf that Cora had carved into the soft inner wood. There was a kitchen area near the entrance where the light was best, with shelves holding their meager supplies. Pots hung from pegs. A flat stone served as a work surface for preparing food. There was a sitting area with stumps for chairs, and a larger stump for a table rolled in from the forest with enormous effort. And above it all, the hollow rose into darkness, a natural chimney that drew out smoke and stale air and let in fresh. It was not a cabin, but it was a home. The people of the logging camp did not know where Cora Whitmore had gone. For a while, they did not care. The depression had made everyone focused on their own survival. A vanished family was simply one less mouth for the community to worry about, one less source of potential charity that they could not afford to give. The foreman had assumed the Whitmores walked to town, perhaps caught a ride to the county seat. He filed his paperwork and rented the cabin to a new family within the week. Life went on, but rumors began to circulate in late spring. A trapper reported seeing smoke rising from a valley that should have been uninhabited, thin and white against the gray sky, coming from somewhere deep in the old growth where no one lived. A logger claimed he had seen a woman walking a game trail miles from anywhere. She had disappeared into the trees before he could call out to her. Someone found small footprints near a creek where no children should have been. 3 sets of tracks, different sizes, leading away into the forest and vanishing among the ferns. The stories spread through the camp in whispers. Some said it was ghosts, the spirits of a family that had died in the forest years ago, still wandering, still searching for home. Others said it was nonsense, tricks of light and imagination, nothing more. George Dawson, the camp foreman who had replaced the man who evicted Cora, was a practical man. He did not believe in ghosts. He did not believe in wild stories or supernatural explanations. But he also did not like mysteries in his forest. And the story of the vanished Whitmore family had been nagging at him since he first heard it. A woman and 3 children did not simply disappear. They went somewhere. And George Dawson decided to find out where. He organized a small search party in late May. Himself and 2 of his most experienced loggers, men who knew the forest, men who could track and navigate and handle themselves if they ran into trouble. They followed the rumors, the smoke that rose from the uninhabited valley, the woman on the game trail, the children's footprints by the creek. It took them 2 days to find the tree. George Dawson would later say that the moment he stepped into that clearing was the moment everything he thought he knew about the Whitmore family changed. He had expected to find desperation, squalor, a family on the verge of starvation waiting to be rescued. Instead, he found Cora Whitmore sitting on a stump in a small clearing teaching her oldest son how to clean a rabbit. She looked up at the approaching men without surprise or fear. wiped her hands on her apron, and asked if they would like some tea. George stared at her. Then he looked past her at the massive tree with its impossible doorway. Then he looked back at her. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, "we thought you were dead." Cora smiled. It was not a happy smile, but it was not an unhappy one either. "Not yet, Mr. Dawson. Would you like to see inside?" George Dawson stepped through the entrance of the hollow tree and stopped so abruptly that the men behind him nearly walked into his back. He had been in the logging business for 30 years, had seen trees of every size and shape, had walked through the great redwood groves when they were still pristine, before the saws came when the forest stretched unbroken from the mountains to the sea. He had never seen anything like this. The hollow was a room, a proper room with a floor and walls and areas designated for different purposes. Children's sleeping quarters marked by hanging blankets, a kitchen with shelves and pots and a work surface, a sitting area with furniture, lamps casting warm light against walls softened by woven mats, and in the center of it all 3 children who looked up at him with curious eyes. They were not starving. They were not sick. They were not desperate or frightened or waiting to be saved. They looked, George thought with growing amazement, healthier than many of the children in the logging camp. The woman, this Cora Whitmore, who had been written off as lost or dead, stood beside him with quiet pride. "We've been here since March," she said. "Almost 3 months now." 3 months, George repeated. "In a tree." "In this tree, yes." He walked the perimeter of the hollow, touching the walls, examining the construction. The stone floor, the clay between the stones, the insulating mats, the carved shelves, the ingenious lamps. "You built all this yourself." "My children helped. Emmett especially." George looked at the serious-faced boy who had returned to cleaning the rabbit, working with a skill that belied his age. "Mrs. Whitmore," George said carefully, "why didn't you come to the camp for help after your husband left? Why didn't you tell anyone where you were going?" Cora's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. "No one offered help that didn't come with conditions I wasn't willing to accept," she said. "The county wanted to take my children. The camp wanted me gone because a woman alone was a problem no one wanted to solve." She paused, looking around at the hollow that had become her home. "This tree doesn't want anything from me except to be treated with respect. That's a bargain I'm happy to make." George did not know what to say to that. He had come expecting to rescue a desperate family. Instead, he had found a woman who had rescued herself. He left with his men promising to tell no one what he had found. But of course, he told everyone. Within a week, half the logging camp had made the 2-mile trek to see the woman who lived in a tree. The reactions were mixed. Some were amazed, even admiring. They called Cora the bravest woman they had ever known. They marveled at what she had built, at the ingenuity and determination it represented. Others were horrified. They insisted that living in a tree was no life for children, that the county should be called, that someone should do something, though none of them seemed willing to be that someone. A few of the wives brought food and clothes for the children, practical charity that Cora accepted with quiet gratitude. Salt and flour and fabric for new dresses, things she could not make or find in the forest. A few of the men offered to help build something more substantial. a real cabin nearby where she could live like a proper person. Cora declined. "I have a home," she said. "I don't need another one." Harold Pruitt was the loudest voice among the skeptics. He ran the company store and considered himself an authority on everything. He was a small man with a large opinion of himself, the kind of man who had never been wrong about anything in his life. At least not according to him. He came to see the tree on the third day of the pilgrimages after most of the camp had already visited and returned with their stories of wonder. He stood in the clearing with his arms crossed and his lip curled. He looked at the tree, at the entrance, at Cora standing beside it with her children gathered around her, and he pronounced his judgment. "This is foolishness," he declared. "Pure foolishness. A hollow tree cannot sustain a family. It cannot protect them from the elements. It cannot keep them warm in winter or dry in the rains." Cora said nothing. "The first real storm will flood that hollow." Harold continued, warming to his subject. "Or the tree will fall. These old trees come down all the time. One good wind and you'll be crushed beneath 1,000 tons of wood." Cora still said nothing. "And the children?" Harold shook his head with exaggerated concern. "The damp and the cold, the lack of proper nutrition. They'll sicken before autumn. Mark my words. This woman is a fool, and her children will pay the price for her foolishness." He looked around at the assembled crowd, expecting nods of agreement. Some people looked away. Others shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. Harold turned back to Cora with a smug expression. "I'll give you until Christmas," he said. "Maybe less. When the snows come and the storms come, and reality comes crashing down, you'll come crawling back to civilization. And I'll be there to say I told you so." Cora looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Pruitt," she said mildly. "I'll keep it in mind." She turned and walked back into her tree. Harold Pruitt had never been wrong about anything in his life. Cora Whitmore was about to become his first lesson in humility. Summer passed gently in the redwood forest. The days were long and mild, the fog rolling in each morning and burning off by noon. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of small animals and the eternal sound of wind in the high branches. Cora expanded her home. She built a covered area outside the entrance, a simple structure of poles and woven branches that created a sheltered space where she could cook even in rainy weather. It kept the cooking fire away from the tree, while still being close enough for convenience. She constructed a small smokehouse 50 yards from the tree, following instructions she half remembered from watching her father cure pork back in Oklahoma. The first batch of smoked rabbit was too salty and too dry. The second was better. By the end of summer, she was producing preserved meat that would last for months. She created a garden in a sunny patch where the canopy opened to the sky. Vegetables grew slowly in the cool climate and filtered light, but they grew. Lettuce and spinach, carrots and turnips, herbs that flavored the simple meals she prepared. She had no seeds to start with, so she gathered what she could. Wild carrot roots to replant, volunteer plants from the gardens of abandoned homesteads she found while exploring, seeds traded from visiting logging wives in exchange for smoked rabbit and foraged mushrooms. The children adapted to their new life with the resilience that only the young possess. Emmett became a skilled hunter and fisherman. He spent hours by the creek perfecting his technique, learning the habits of the trout and the steelhead that ran in autumn. He studied the fish the way another boy might study books, noting when they fed and where they hid and what flies were hatching on any given day. He built his own bow from a yew branch, following instructions from a logger who had learned the craft from his grandfather. The first bow broke on its third pull. The second lasted a week. The third was a weapon that any adult would have been proud to own. He practiced shooting until his fingers were raw and calloused, until he could hit a target the size of an apple from 30 yards, until the bow felt like an extension of his arm. By the end of summer, Emmett was providing more meat for the family than they could eat. The surplus he traded with visiting families from the camp. Fresh game in exchange for flour salt cloth tools. The economy of the forest operating on principles as old as humanity itself. Opal took charge of the garden and the gathering of wild foods. Her encyclopedic knowledge of the forest's bounty grew with each passing week. She learned which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill you. She learned where the huckleberries grew thickest and when the acorns were ready to harvest. She learned to make tea from pine needles and medicine from willow bark. Cora taught her what she knew, which was not much, but Opal's knowledge soon exceeded her mother's. She became a repository of forest wisdom, a 7-year-old expert in a field that had no name, but that would later be called foraging or wild crafting or simply living off the land. She kept a journal of sorts, drawings of plants with notes about where to find them and how to use them. The paper was precious scraps saved from any source she could find. But the knowledge she recorded was more precious still. Little Teddy was too young for serious work, but he was not too young to learn. He spent his days exploring the forest under his mother's watchful eye, building a knowledge of the land that would serve him for the rest of his life. He named the birds and the animals, tracked their movements, understood their behaviors. He could tell you which way the deer would run before you startled them, where the bears denned in winter, when the salmon would return to the creek, what the different bird calls meant and what weather was coming based on how the squirrels were behaving. The forest was his classroom, and he was its most devoted student. Fall brought rain, endless rain that turned the forest floor to mud and swelled the creeks beyond their banks. The fog stopped burning off at noon and hung in the trees all day, dripping from every surface, saturating everything. Cora had prepared for this. She had dug drainage channels around the tree's base, shallow trenches that directed water away from the entrance and down the slope toward the creek. She had gathered and dried enough wood to last for months, stacking it in the covered area where it would stay dry. She had preserved food in every way she knew, smoking and drying and salting, storing in the coolest corner of the hollow where the temperature stayed constant, regardless of the weather outside. When the rains came, the Whitmore family retreated into their tree and waited them out. And while they waited comfortable and dry, the logging camp struggled. Roofs leaked, roads flooded, tools rusted and clothes mildewed and tempers frayed. But inside, the redwood life went on as usual. The children did their lessons in the lamplight. Cora had salvaged a few books from the cabin, and she supplemented them with lessons of her own devising. Reading and arithmetic and history taught the way her mother had taught her, with stories and examples and endless patience. She told them about the world beyond the forest, about cities and oceans and deserts and mountains, about the way things used to be before the Depression and the way things might be again someday. She did not know if they would ever see that world, but she wanted them to be ready for it if they did. November passed. The rain continued. December arrived with a cold snap that turned the rain to frost. And then in the second week of December, the storm came. It began on a Tuesday. A cold front sweeping down from Alaska collided with the warm Pacific air and created a weather event that the old-timers would talk about for decades. The kind of storm that separated the prepared from the unprepared, the living from the dead. The wind came first, gusts of 50 miles per hour, then 60, then 70. The mighty redwoods trees that had stood for 1,000 years bent before it, like grass in a gale. Branches tore loose and crashed to the forest floor with sounds like cannon fire. Then the rain came, not falling but flying. Horizontal sheets of water mixed with sleet and hail that stung exposed skin like needles that found every gap in every roof that turned every road into a river. Then the temperature dropped. The rain became snow. Heavy, wet snow that accumulated on branches already stressed by wind. Branches that cracked and fell under the weight. Trees that had survived everything the centuries could throw at them, finally giving way, toppling in explosions of wood and snow. In the logging camp, chaos. 2 cabins lost their roofs in the first night. The families inside fled to neighbors, cramming into spaces already too small for the families who lived there. The company store flooded when a creek changed course and ran straight through the building. Harold Pruitt spent the night trying to save his inventory, wading through knee-deep water, watching his profits wash away into the darkness. 3 men were injured by falling branches. One seriously enough that he would never work again. His back broken by a limb the size of a telephone pole. No one slept that night. No one knew if they would survive to see morning. 2 miles away in a hollow tree that had stood for 2,000 years, Cora Whitmore and her children played cards by candlelight. The tree did not care about the storm. It had survived countless storms in its long life, had bent with winds that toppled lesser trees, had shed snow loads that would crush a cabin flat. Its roots went down 20 feet into the earth, anchoring it against anything the sky could throw. Its hollow interior was insulated by 3 feet of living wood. The temperature inside stayed remarkably constant, cool in summer and warm in winter, regardless of what was happening outside. The entrance faced away from the prevailing wind just as Cora had noticed on the very first day, and the covered area she had built deflected the worst of the rain. They could hear the storm raging outside. They could feel the tree sway slightly in the strongest gusts, a gentle rocking motion that Teddy said felt like being in a boat. But inside they were warm. Inside they were dry. Inside they were safe. Cora dealt another hand of cards and watched her children's faces in the lamplight. Emmett was concentrating on his hand with fierce intensity. Opal was giggling at something Teddy had said. Teddy was arranging his cards with the serious expression of a 5-year-old who did not quite understand the game, but was determined to win anyway. Outside, the world was ending. Inside, her family was playing cards. Cora thought about Harold Pruitt and his confident prediction. She'll be dead before Christmas. She smiled to herself. Christmas was 2 weeks away, and she had never felt more alive. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind and rain and snow and terror for those who were exposed to it. 3 days of howling darkness and crashing trees and the constant fear that the next gust would be the one that brought everything down. On the fourth day, silence. Cora woke to an absence of sound that was almost more unnerving than the storm itself. No wind, no rain, no creaking of branches. Just stillness, perfect and complete. She wrapped herself in a blanket and walked to the entrance of the hollow. What she saw took her breath away. The forest had been transformed. Trees were down everywhere, their massive trunks crisscrossing the landscape like the aftermath of a giant's game of pickup sticks. Branches and debris carpeted the ground some piles higher than her head. The snow lay thick on everything pristine and white and beautiful in the pale morning light. It looked like the end of the world. But her tree still stood. Her garden, sheltered by the bulk of the trunk, had survived mostly intact. Her smokehouse had lost its roof, but the walls were still standing. The covered cooking area had collapsed under the weight of the snow, but that could be rebuilt. Everything essential had survived. Cora led her children carefully through the wreckage that morning, checking on everything they had built over the past 9 months. The spring was still flowing, though the path to it was blocked by a fallen tree they would have to climb over. The creek where Emmett fished had changed course slightly, but the fish were still there. They had made it. They had survived the worst storm in living memory, and they had done it inside a tree. When news reached the logging camp that the Whitmore family had weathered the storm without incident, the reaction was disbelief. George Dawson organized another expedition to confirm what the rumors were saying. He brought 10 men with him this time, some of them the same skeptics who had laughed at Cora in the spring. What they found silenced even the loudest of them. Cora's tree stood undamaged amid a forest of destruction. The massive redwood had shed the storm like water off a duck's back, its roots holding firm while younger, smaller trees crashed down around it. Inside the hollow was warm and dry. The children looked healthy and well-fed, better fed than many of the children in the camp, who had spent the storm huddled in leaking cabins. Cora offered the visitors hot tea and dried venison, served inside a hollow tree that was warmer than many of the cabins they had left behind. George Dawson accepted a cup with hands that were still cold from the trek through the snow. He looked around at what Cora had built, at the stone floor and the insulated walls and the clever lamps, at the children doing their lessons in the corner, Emmett helping Opal with her letters while Teddy practiced his numbers on a scrap of paper. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, "I owe you an apology. We all do." Cora shook her head. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Dawson. You've always been kind when you came to visit. That's more than I could have asked for." Still, George looked down at his tea. "We should have done more. Should have helped more. Instead of just watching and waiting to see if you'd fail. Some of you did help. Some of you brought food and clothes and tools. That meant more than you know." George thought about Harold Pruitt and his confident predictions, about the other skeptics who had given Cora until Christmas. Christmas was 10 days away, and Cora Whitmore was not dead. She was thriving. Harold Pruitt did not join the expedition to the tree. He could not bring himself to face the woman he had so confidently predicted would fail. He stayed in his damaged store trying to salvage what was left of his inventory, avoiding the eyes of everyone who passed. But he heard the stories. He saw the amazement in the eyes of those who returned, and he knew that he had been wrong. Wrong in a way that would follow him for the rest of his life. The storm broke something in the community. some barrier of skepticism and judgment that had kept them at arm's length from the Whitmore family. After the storm, people began to visit not out of curiosity, but out of genuine interest. They wanted to know how Cora had done it, how she had turned a hollow tree into a home that outperformed their own cabins. They wanted to learn. And Cora, who had taught herself everything she knew through trial and error and sheer determination, was willing to teach them. She showed them how she had managed drainage and insulation, how she had positioned her fire to avoid danger while still providing warmth, how she had stored food and preserved supplies. She explained the principle she had discovered by accident, that the massive walls of living wood acted as a thermal buffer, absorbing heat during warmer periods and releasing it when the temperature dropped, maintaining a more stable interior climate than any wooden cabin could achieve. She showed them the natural ventilation created by the hollow's height, how warm air rose and escaped through openings above, drawing fresh air in through the entrance below. A constant, gentle circulation that kept the air inside fresh and prevented the buildup of smoke and moisture. The logging wives were particularly interested in her methods of food preservation. Cora had learned that the tree's interior, with its constant cool temperature and low humidity, was perfect for storing dried foods. She had created a system of hanging baskets and shelves that kept supplies off the floor and safe from insects. She had discovered which local plants had natural preservative properties and used them to extend the life of her stores. By her second year in the tree, she was preserving food more successfully than women with proper root cellars and spring houses. She did not have all the answers, she admitted. Much of what she had done was instinct and improvisation, but the results spoke for themselves. The visitors returned to camp with new ideas, new techniques, new respect for a woman who had taken nothing and made something from it. And from that winter forward, Cora Whitmore was no longer the foolish woman who lived in a tree. She was a teacher, a survivor, a legend in the making. Christmas came 10 days after the storm. Cora woke early that morning and built a fire outside the entrance. She cooked a special breakfast with hoarded ingredients, eggs traded from a logging family that kept chickens, flour and sugar for pancakes, precious honey gathered from a wild hive that Emmett had found in the fall. The children woke to the smell of food and the sight of small gifts arranged on the table. Cora had worked on them in secret in the late hours when the children slept. A new fishing lure for Emmett carved from bone, a pressed flower journal for Opal bound with leather scraps, a wooden horse for Teddy to replace the one his father had made, which had broken beyond repair. They were small things, simple things, but the children's faces when they saw them were worth more than any store-bought treasure. After breakfast, they walked to the edge of the clearing and looked out at the forest transformed by snow. Emmett was quiet as always, but there was a peace in his eyes that had not been there in March, an acceptance of the way things were. Opal was already planning which plants to look for when spring came, already thinking about the garden and the gathering and all the things she would learn. Teddy was playing in the snow, his laughter echoing off the trees. Cora watched them and felt something settle in her heart. Something that had been broken was beginning to heal. Not whole yet, but healing. She thought about Vernon. For the first time in months, she let herself think about her husband. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether he ever thought about the family he had left behind. She wondered if he was alive. She wondered if she cared. Standing there in the snow, watching her children play, Cora realized that the answer did not matter. Vernon had made his choice. She had made hers. And looking at what she had built, at what they had survived, at the home she had created from nothing but determination and an ancient tree she knew, she had chosen right. She stepped into that tree as a victim. 23 years later, she stepped out as a legend. But between those two moments lies a story that most people never hear. A story of transformation, of community, of children growing into adults within wooden walls, and of a question that lingered for decades. Whatever happened to the man who left? The answer, when it finally came, would prove something that Cora Whitmore had known all along. History does not remember those who run away. It remembers those who stay. The storm of December 1932 changed everything, not just for Cora and her children, but for the entire logging community. The people who had watched from a distance, some with admiration and some with skepticism, could no longer maintain their separation. The storm had shown them something they could not ignore. A woman living in a tree had survived better than they had. A mother with 3 children. No husband and no resources except her own determination had weathered the worst storm in memory, while their cabins flooded and their roofs collapsed. That fact demanded explanation. It demanded humility. And for some, it demanded change. They came to Cora in the weeks after the storm, not as curious visitors anymore, but as students, as neighbors, as people who had finally recognized that this strange woman in her ancient tree had something to teach them. George Dawson came first, the camp foreman who had always treated Cora with respect, even when others mocked her. He brought a notebook and a pencil and sat on a stump outside the tree while Cora explained her methods. Drainage, she told him. The most important thing was keeping water away from your foundation. She showed him the channels she had dug around the tree's base, simple trenches that directed rainwater downhill before it could pool at the entrance. Insulation, she continued. The woven mats she had hung on the walls. The way she had used dried grasses and ferns to trap air and hold warmth inside. Thermal mass, she said, though she did not know the scientific term for it. The tree's thick walls absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. That was why the hollow stayed comfortable even when the temperature outside dropped below freezing. Ventilation, food preservation, fire safety, water collection. George wrote it all down. When he returned to camp, he shared what he had learned with anyone who would listen. Some of the techniques Cora had developed were new to the loggers despite their years in the forest. Others were old knowledge that had been forgotten in the transition from frontier life to company housing. Knowledge that their grandparents had possessed, but that had been lost in a single generation. Cora helped them remember. The women came next, logging wives who had looked down on Cora when she first moved into the tree, who had whispered about her behind their hands and predicted her failure with certainty born of their own insecurity. Now they came with gifts, flour and sugar and salt, fabric for new clothes, seeds for the spring garden, practical offerings that acknowledged without words that they had been wrong. Cora accepted everything with quiet grace. She did not rub their faces in her success, did not remind them of their predictions or their mockery. She simply welcomed them into her home and showed them what she had built. And then she taught them. Food preservation became her specialty. The tree's interior, with its constant cool temperature, was better than any root cellar these women had ever used. Cora showed them how to build similar storage spaces in their own homes, how to use the natural properties of certain plants to extend the life of preserved foods, how to smoke meat properly, how to dry vegetables, how to store grains so it would not mold or attract insects. The women returned to their cabins with new knowledge, with new skills, and with a new respect for the woman they had once dismissed. Harold Pruitt never came to the tree. In the months after the storm, he rebuilt his store and restocked his inventory. He continued to run his business, to pronounce his opinions, to act as though he were the most important man in the camp. But something had changed. He no longer spoke about Cora Whitmore. When her name came up in conversation, he found reasons to walk away. When visitors from other camps asked about the woman who lived in a tree, Harold pretended not to hear the question. His silence spoke louder than any apology could have. Everyone knew what it meant. Harold Pruitt had been wrong, and he could not bring himself to admit it. So he simply stopped talking about it, and in that silence his authority began to erode. People who had once listened to his pronouncements with respect now questioned them. People who had once deferred to his judgment now sought second opinions. The man who had never been wrong about anything was now the man who had been wrong about the most important thing. Cora did not gloat. She barely seemed to notice. But she had won something more valuable than any argument. She had won her reputation. Spring came to the redwood forest with an explosion of green. The damage from the storm healed slowly, but it healed. New growth covered the fallen trees. Ferns unfurled over the debris. The forest, ancient and patient, absorbed the destruction and incorporated it into itself. Life went on. Cora's second year in the tree was easier than the first. She knew now what worked and what did not. She knew which plants to cultivate and which to avoid. She knew how to preserve food for the lean months and how to find fresh food even in the depths of winter. The community helped in ways large and small. Some of the men came one weekend and built a proper covered platform outside the tree's entrance. A solid floor of split logs, a sloped roof, to shed rain walls on 3 sides to block the wind. It doubled the usable living space without touching the tree itself. Others helped construct a permanent smokehouse, replacing the makeshift structure that had been damaged in the storm. A proper door with proper hinges. A chimney that drew smoke efficiently. Racks inside for hanging meat. A chicken coop appeared one morning, built overnight by anonymous hands. Cora found it stocked with 3 hens and a rooster, a gift that would provide eggs for years to come. She did not know who to thank, so she thanked everyone. The children continued to grow. Emmett turned 10 that spring, then 11, then 12. He grew tall and strong, hardened by the work of survival, skilled in ways that most adults could not match. He could track a deer through the forest and bring it down with a single arrow. He could catch fish with his bare hands if he had to. He could build a shelter in an hour that would keep a man warm through the coldest night. But he remained serious, quiet. He carried something heavy inside him, something that Cora could see but could not reach. the weight of responsibility taken on too young, the ghost of a father who had abandoned him. She worried about him sometimes, but she also saw the man he was becoming, a good man, a strong man, a man who would never abandon those who depended on him. Opal turned 8, then 9, then 10. Her knowledge of the forest continued to expand until there was almost nothing she did not know about the plants that grew in these woods. She could identify 100 species by sight, could tell you which ones healed and which ones harmed, could brew teas and tinctures and poultices that eased pain and fought infection. Word spread beyond the logging camp. People came from other settlements, sometimes traveling miles to consult with the girl who knew the plants. They brought their ailments and their injuries, their questions and their hopes. Opal helped them all. She did not charge for her services, though she accepted gifts of food and supplies. She was not doing it for money. She was doing it because she could not imagine doing anything else. The forest had taught her its secrets. Sharing those secrets was the least she could do in return. Teddy turned 6, then 7, then 8. He remained the lightest spirit of the 3 children, the quickest to laugh, the most likely to find joy in small things. But beneath that lightness was a mind that never stopped observing. He knew the forest the way other children knew their neighborhoods, every tree, every trail, every creature that lived and breathed and moved through the undergrowth. He could predict the weather by watching the animals, could tell you when the salmon would run by the behavior of the birds, could find water in places that looked bone dry by reading signs that others could not see. The forest was his home in a way that it was not quite home for his siblings. Emmett loved the forest for what it provided. Opal loved the forest for what it taught. Teddy loved the forest for what it was. Years passed. The Depression eased slowly, and then more quickly. The logging industry recovered. New families came to the camp. Old families moved away. But Cora stayed. The tree remained her home through the 30s and into the 40s, through the fear of war and the relief of peace, through the changes that transformed America from a nation of struggle to a nation of prosperity. She watched it all from her hollow in the ancient redwood, and the ancient redwood watched over her. Visitors continued to come. The story of the woman who lived in a tree spread far beyond Humboldt County. A newspaper reporter wrote about her in 1938, and the article was picked up by papers across the country. Suddenly, people who had never heard of the redwood forests were reading about Cora Whitmore and her remarkable home. Letters arrived from strangers, from Ohio and Florida and New York, from people who had lost everything in the Depression and wanted to know how she had survived, from people who admired her courage and wanted to tell her so, from people who were struggling with their own hardships and found hope in her story. Cora answered every letter. She did not seek the attention, did not try to profit from it. She simply lived her life, and when people wanted to know about that life, she told them. A photographer came in 1942, a man from San Francisco who was working on a book about the redwood forests. He spent 3 days at the tree capturing images of Cora and her children of the hollow interior and the surrounding forest of a way of life that would never be repeated. Those photographs would end up in libraries and museums. They would be reproduced in books and magazines for decades. They would become the visual record of something that words alone could not capture. But Cora herself remained unchanged. She did not let the attention alter her. She was not living in a tree for the attention. She was living in a tree because it was her home. The question of Vernon Whitmore hung over everything. Cora never spoke of her husband, never mentioned his name, never answered questions about where he had gone or what had happened to him. The children learned early not to ask. Emmett remembered his father, but the memories were fading, replaced by the reality of life without him. Opal had only vague impressions, images, and feelings that she could not quite place. Teddy remembered nothing at all. His father was a concept, not a person, a word, not a face. But the question remained. Where was Vernon Whitmore? Rumors circulated through the years. Some said he had died in a car accident somewhere in Oregon not long after he left. Crashed his truck on a mountain road and burned with it. Others said he had made it to Alaska chasing the dream of gold that had lured so many desperate men north during the Depression. That he had frozen to death in a mining camp alone and unmourned. Still others said he was alive somewhere, living under a different name, building a different life. Perhaps he had another family now. Perhaps he had forgotten the wife and children he had left behind in the redwood forest. Cora never confirmed or denied any of the stories. When asked, she simply said nothing. Her silence was its own kind of answer. The truth, when it finally came, arrived in 1948. 16 years after Vernon had driven away without looking back. A letter came to the logging camp addressed to Cora Whitmore. It had been forwarded several times, passing through different hands, taking months to reach its destination. The letter was from a lawyer in Fairbanks, Alaska. It informed Cora that her husband, Vernon Whitmore, had died in 1936. He had been working at a gold mining operation in the interior, had gotten drunk one night and wandered away from the camp. His body had been found in the spring thaw, frozen solid, half buried in snow. He had been dead for 12 years before anyone thought to notify his family. The lawyer had only discovered Cora's existence while settling the affairs of the mining company which had recently closed. Vernon's personal effects had been stored in a warehouse all this time. Did she want them shipped to her? His personal effects consisted of a change of clothes, a few dollars in cash, and a single photograph. The photograph showed Cora and the 3 children. It had been taken in the logging camp months before Vernon left. He had carried it with him all the way to Alaska. Had carried it for 4 years, until the cold took him. Cora read the letter standing outside the tree. Her children were grown now, or nearly so. Emmett was 25, working as a carpenter in a nearby town. Opal was 23, married to a good man, building a life of her own. Teddy was 21, studying at a university, preparing for a career as a naturalist. They had survived. They had thrived. And the man who had abandoned them had died alone in the snow, clutching a photograph of what he had thrown away. Cora folded the letter carefully. She walked to the fire pit outside the entrance of the tree, and she burned the letter just as she had burned his note 16 years before. Opal found her there an hour later, sitting on a stump staring at the ashes. "Mama, what's wrong?" Cora looked up at her daughter, this beautiful young woman who had grown from a curious 7-year-old into a healer, a wife, a person of strength and compassion. "Your father is dead," Cora said. Opal was quiet for a long moment. "How long?" 12 years. He died in Alaska. They only just found out about us." Opal sat down beside her mother. They were silent together, watching the ashes cool. "Do you want to talk about it?" Opal finally asked. Cora considered the question. She thought about Vernon, about the man she had married, about the years they had spent together, about the morning he had driven away. She thought about what she had built since then, the home, the family, the life. She thought about what he had built. Nothing. "He made his choice," Cora said finally. "I made mine. History will remember one of us." She stood up, brushed off her skirt, and walked back into the tree. She never spoke of Vernon again. The tree remained Cora's home for 23 years. She had entered it as a desperate mother of 31 fleeing eviction with 3 young children and no prospects. She would leave it as a woman of 54, a grandmother, a legend whose story had spread across the country. But she did not leave willingly. The years in the tree had been kind to her in many ways. The physical work had kept her strong. The simple diet had kept her healthy. The purpose of raising her children had kept her mind sharp and her spirit determined. But time takes its toll on everyone. By 1955, Cora's body was beginning to fail her in ways she could not ignore. Her joints ached in the cold weather, a pain that had started as a whisper and grown into a shout. Her eyes, which had spent so many years reading by lamplight, were growing dim. She could no longer carry the load she once carried, climb the hills she once climbed, work the hours she once worked. The tree that had sheltered her for more than 2 decades was becoming harder to live in. The steps up to the entrance that she had climbed 1,000 times now left her breathless. The winters that she had weathered with ease now seemed longer and colder. The isolation that had once been a refuge now felt like a burden. Opal saw it first. She had been visiting her mother regularly, bringing her grandchildren to see the tree where their grandmother lived, the tree that had become famous in their world. She saw the way Cora moved more slowly, the way she paused at the top of the steps to catch her breath, the way she squinted at things that should have been easy to see. "Mama," Opal said one spring day in 1955. "Come live with us." Cora was sitting on the platform outside the tree watching her grandchildren play in the clearing. 2 girls and a boy aged 3, 5, and 7. The same ages her own children had been when she first came to this place. "I have a home," Cora said. The same words she had said 23 years ago when people had offered to help her build something else. "I know you do," Opal said gently. "But homes can change. People can have more than one home in a lifetime." Cora was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the tree, at the entrance she had walked through so many times, at the hollow inside where she had raised her children. Weathered storms built a life from nothing. She thought about the years that were behind her. She thought about the years that were ahead. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for 6 months. 6 months of watching herself slow down. 6 months of winters that felt colder and summers that passed too quickly. 6 months of climbing those steps and feeling the protest of her aging body. 6 months of visiting her grandchildren and feeling the warmth of family that she had created, but could not fully share from her hollow in the woods. In the fall of 1955, Cora Whitmore made a decision. She would leave the tree. Not because she had to, but because it was time. The morning she left, she woke before dawn. She had said her goodbyes the day before. Her children had come, all three of them. Emmett, who was now a master carpenter with his own business. Opal, who was a respected healer with patients throughout the county. Teddy, who had become exactly what his childhood had prepared him to be, a naturalist who studied the forests of California for the State Parks Department. They had sat together in the hollow one last time. They had talked about the memories they shared, the first weeks of fear and uncertainty, the first rabbit Cora had caught, the first fish Emmett had landed, the storm that had nearly destroyed the logging camp but had left them untouched, the visitors who had come to marvel and stayed to learn, the years that had somehow become decades. They had laughed. They had cried. They had held each other in the space that had been their world. And then they had left, promising to return in the morning to help her move. But Cora wanted this last morning alone. She walked through the hollow one more time, touching the walls she had touched so many times before. The smooth wood that had been worn even smoother by years of hands and shoulders brushing against it. She looked at the places where she had carved shelves and hung lamps. The area where the children had slept, marked by the faded remnants of the blankets she had hung for privacy. The kitchen corner where she had prepared thousands of meals. She looked at the marks on the wall where she had measured her children's growth. Emmett, Opal, Teddy. Lines scratched into the wood, each one representing a birthday, a milestone, a moment frozen in time. The highest marks were at shoulder height now. Her children had grown up in this tree, and now they were grown. Cora walked to the entrance and looked out at the forest. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the fog in shades of gold and pink. The redwoods stood sentinel in every direction, ancient and patient witnesses to centuries of human struggle and triumph. She had been part of their story for 23 years, a blink of an eye to trees that measured their lives in millennia. But to her, it had been everything. She spoke to the tree then for the first and last time. "Thank you," she said, "for taking us in, for keeping us safe, for being what we needed when we needed it." The tree did not answer, but the wind stirred in its branches a soft sound like a sigh, and Cora chose to believe that it had heard her. When her children arrived an hour later, she was ready. She had packed her few possessions, the photographs, the letters from strangers, the gifts her children had made her over the years, the tools she had used to build a life. Everything else she left behind. The lamps and the shelves and the woven mats, the marks on the wall, the memories. The tree would keep them safe. Opal had prepared a cottage for her in town, a small place, comfortable and warm, with windows that looked out on a garden and neighbors who waved when they passed. It was nothing like the tree, nothing like the forest, nothing like the life Cora had lived for more than 2 decades. But it was good. It was enough. Cora Whitmore lived in that cottage for 3 more years. She spent her days in the garden growing vegetables and herbs, using the skills she had developed in the forest. She spent her evenings with her grandchildren, telling them stories about the tree, about the forest, about the mother who had refused to give up. She watched her children thrive. Emmett built houses and furniture that were known throughout the county for their quality. He married a woman who loved him as he was serious and strong and steady. He had children of his own, and he taught them to build and to hunt and to survive. Opal continued her work as a healer. Her reputation grew until people came from hundreds of miles away to seek her help. She trained apprentices, passing on the knowledge that she had gathered in the forest, knowledge that would be passed on again and again through generations. Teddy published papers and books about the natural history of California. He became a professor at the university, teaching students who went on to protect the very forests where he had grown up. He never married, but he was never lonely. The forest was his companion, as it had always been. Cora watched all of this from her cottage, and she was proud. Proud of what she had built. Proud of who her children had become. Proud of the life that had grown from nothing. Cora Whitmore died on a spring morning in 1958. She was 57 years old. She died in her sleep peacefully without pain. She died surrounded by the things she loved. Photographs of her children and grandchildren. Pressed flowers that Opal had given her. A small carving that Emmett had made. A bird's nest that Teddy had found and saved for her. She died knowing that she had won. Not against Vernon. Not against the skeptics. Not against the hardships that had tried to break her. She had won against despair. Against the voice that had whispered in those first terrible days that she should give up. That she should surrender. That she should let the world take her children and accept her fate. She had refused. And in that refusal, she had found everything. The tree still stands today. It is protected now, part of a state park that preserves some of the last old-growth redwoods in California. Rangers lead tours to see it, telling the story of Cora Whitmore and her children to visitors from around the world. The hollow is empty now, cleared of the furnishings and tools that Cora accumulated over 2 decades. But you can still see the marks she left, the places where she carved shelves into the wood, the smoke stains on the ceiling from thousands of cooking fires, the worn places on the floor where generations of feet walked the same paths. If you visit the tree on a quiet morning when the fog is thick and the tourists have not yet arrived, you can almost hear them. The children laughing, the mother calling them to supper, the sound of a family living their lives in the most unlikely of places. The rangers will tell you that the tree is just a tree, that the hollow is just a hollow, that the story is just a story. But the marks are still there, and the people who see them know the truth. This tree was a home. This hollow was a sanctuary. And the woman who lived here changed what everyone thought they knew about survival, about shelter, about what a family can endure. What would you do if you found yourself abandoned with nothing but your children and a forest? What would you build? What would you become if the world expected you to fail? These are not hypothetical questions. They are questions that Cora Whitmore answered with her life. She did not answer them with words or theories or good intentions. She answered them with actions, with determination, with a refusal to accept the limits that others placed on her. When Vernon Whitmore drove away that morning in 1932, he took everything. The money, the security, the future she had planned. But he did not take her ability to build again. He did not take her children. He did not take her will. And those were the things that mattered. Vernon died alone in the snow, clutching a photograph of what he had thrown away. Cora died surrounded by family in a bed, in a cottage that her children had given her, knowing that her legacy would outlive her by generations. History does not remember those who run away. It remembers those who stay. The lesson of Cora Whitmore's life is simple but easy to forget. When someone takes everything from you, they have not taken your ability to build again. When the world writes you off as lost, you are not obligated to accept its verdict. And when you find yourself with nothing standing in a forest, with children who depend on you, and no idea how you will survive, sometimes the answer is not to search for what you think you need, but to recognize what is already there, waiting to be seen, waiting to be transformed, waiting to become something no one expected. The redwood forests of Northern California are among the most ancient and magnificent places on Earth. Trees that were saplings when Christ was born still stand there, monuments to endurance and patience and the slow accumulation of years. Most of them have never been anything but trees. But one of them for 23 years was something more. It was a home, a refuge, a testament to human resilience. It was proof that even when someone leaves you with nothing, nothing can still become everything. Somewhere out there right now, someone is standing at the edge of a forest with nothing. Maybe they just lost their job. Maybe they just lost their spouse. Maybe they just lost everything they thought they had. And maybe they are about to discover what Cora Whitmore discovered in the spring of 1932. That the forest is not an obstacle. It is an opportunity. That the tree is not just a tree. It is a home. That nothing is not the end. It is the beginning. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what shelter means and what families can endure, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories like this one every week. Stories of people who refuse to accept the limits others placed on them. Stories of mothers and fathers and children who found strength they did not know they had. Stories that prove again and again that the human spirit is stronger than any hardship. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and I will see you in the next video, because the next story is waiting. And it might be exactly what you need to hear.